welcome everyone to this special session on the UN high-level political forum and SDGs localization. This is an upcoming United Nations meeting that takes place every summer, bringing the world together to talk about the SDGs. So we have a couple great speakers here today who have lots of experience participating. So we'll dive into a conversation with them shortly. My name is Jon Beale. I'm the manager at SDSN Canada, which is based at the University of Waterloo. And I'm joined today by my co-host for the session, Laura Schnurr from the Tamarack Institute, as well as our colleagues Marinike and Chiara and Jennifer, who will be helping to support the meeting. And as we welcome you to the session, I'd like to acknowledge the history of the lands on which we gather. And I invite everyone to reflect on the place from which you're joining in from today and your relationship with that land. So for SDSN Canada and the Tamarack Institute's offices, we're both located at the University of Waterloo on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And Kitchener-Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. And I think, as we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, these acknowledgements are especially important because they remind us, that Canada's achievements to date are really directly related to the resources and the friendship of Indigenous peoples, and that we all must push through our work for transformative acts over the coming decade towards reconciliation and justice. And I'd like to invite everyone, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're coming in from, and if you'd like to learn more about Indigenous territories, languages, lands, and ways of life, you can visit the link in the chat, nativeland.ca. So thank you for joining today's webinar. This conversation is part of a monthly gathering we organize for our Localizing the SDGs community of practice. The community is co-founded and hosted by the Tamarack Institute's Community Climate Transitions team, as well as SDSN Canada at the University of Waterloo. And it's really a network, a monthly conversation devoted to accelerating the localization of the Sustainable Development Goals, bringing these kind of big, ambitious international targets and indicators and goals into our communities at the local level. So we've explored a range of topics in that respect over the past year and a half, 2 years, ranging from how do we develop data systems on reporting for the SDGs, brokering academic and community partnerships, creating collective impact, reporting progress, and many other topic areas. So the community has over 200 participants representing many different sectors, from elected leaders, municipal staff, nonprofit and community sector leaders, post-secondary staff and faculty, and foundations and funders. So we'll put the link into the chat for those looking for more info on this community, and it's a free membership to join if that's of interest. And so for today's conversation, I'm really pleased to welcome Mayor Berry Vrbanovic from the City of Kitchener in Ontario, and Elena Pierce, who works in the Sustainability Directorate at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And both have many years of experience advocating for municipalities and the SDGs, both internationally and in Canada. So welcome, Mayor Berry and Elena, to today's session. And we'll kind of turn things over to you both really shortly. But before that, I'll give a little kind of context piece on localization and the high-level political forum for those interested. So the Sustainable Development Goals, as many of you know, were adopted in 2015 by every world leader as an ambitious plan for a better world across environmental, economic, and social domains. And this year actually marks the halfway point of the SDGs mandate, with 2030 being the agreed end date for the goals. But we know currently no country is on track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And we know Canada ranks 26th in the world in terms of progress. With the COVID pandemic, we've been set back in terms of our global progress on the SDGs. And we see continued environmental disasters and international wars that make it all the more difficult to get on track. So we have our work cut out for us in terms of really leaning into the SDGs. But despite these challenges, the SDGs are as important as ever to raise our ambitions about how we might achieve, or about what we might achieve by working together, whether across society, across countries, to deal with our biggest challenges. And a critical part of getting the SDGs right is how we take this big global agenda and bring it into our communities, this localization effect, as I mentioned, bringing it into our communities, our cities, our daily lives. So this term SDGs localization, it's really about how do we integrate the SDGs at a local level. And so the United Nations High-Level Political Forum is essentially a check-in point every year at the UN. It's a 2-week-long gathering at UN headquarters in New York City in July. And it's really designed for the world to come together to take stock of progress, and usually it does feature country representatives presenting their progress reports on the SDGs so far. So Canada actually will be presenting its second progress report this July on the SDGs to the global stage. And these progress reports, for the technical language, are known as voluntary national reviews. And kind of complementing these progress reports, there are hundreds of side events organized by civil society and special interest groups, making the HLPF a really vibrant global gathering for anyone interested in the latest on the SDGs. And so I mentioned Canada is going to be presenting its second progress report, and this is within the context within Canada of a couple important guiding strategies, most notably the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, which Elena will talk a little bit about as well. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Laura to introduce our speakers and kind of kick off the conversation. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Jon, and thank you all for being here. So really excited for this session. We have two fantastic speakers with us today. So we have Mayor Berry Vrbanovic of the city of Kitchener, who was first elected as mayor of the city in 2014 after serving as city councillor from 1994 to 2014. He was re-elected in 2018 and 2022 and is committed to improving the quality of life for residents in Kitchener and throughout the region of Waterloo. Mayor Vrbanovic has been very active in the SDGs internationally, serving in a number of roles to support them, including as co-president of United Cities and Local Governments, president emeritus of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM, and FCM's Green Municipal Fund Council. And Elena Pierce, acting manager of policy and engagement team with the Sustainability Directorate at Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC. And before joining ECCC, Elena worked on municipal issues across Canada and around the world. She has been active in promoting community-based initiatives in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals internationally, including toward the multilateral community since the adoption of the goals in 2015. So we're thrilled to have the two of you here today. Welcome to have this important conversation about what we can expect at the high-level political forum, why it matters to folks on the ground here working in communities, and what opportunities there are to really link the SDG action happening locally in communities with these international global conversations. So I'm going to launch into it. I'm going to start with you, Mayor Vrbanovic, and ask, as someone who's been involved for many, many years working on the SDGs, both locally and internationally, can you tell us a bit about your story of how you've gotten involved at that international level and how you've seen the conversation on cities and the SDGs evolve over time?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Laura. And really, before I answer that, I do want to take this opportunity to say thank you to you and to Jon and Morinike and everyone at both SDSN and Tamarack for the ongoing work that all of you are doing in this space, because I really think it is so important in terms of supporting cities and community partners to ensure that Canada continues to lead in this important space, particularly when we consider the fact that our Prime Minister, together with the Prime Minister of Barbados, are SDG advocates as appointed by the UN Secretary General. For me, my involvement goes back a long way in international work, and so without boring everyone too much, but it really started, I mean, I did some work in Bosnia with Canadian Urban Institute before FCM, but my real work at FCM started post-tsunami in Sri Lanka and Indonesia, where the Federation of Canadian Municipalities through CETA at the time was very involved in projects that eventually led to my involvement at UCLG. And some of you may be wondering, what is UCLG? Well, United Cities and Local Governments is the global version of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and its members are national associations and cities and communities from around the world. And I have the privilege of serving as co-president of that organization now until 2026. And it's through UCLG where the world's cities and regions have a voice at the United Nations and other international fora. And it was there that UCLG played a significant role in advocating for cities to not only be a cross-cutting theme in the Sustainable Development Goals, but in fact be actively engaged in their development and ultimately in ensuring that SDG 11 was one of the SDGs in terms of sustainable cities and communities. And so, you know, what I would tell you, it's through that mechanism that I've continued to be involved in. Elena, in her previous role at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and others, helped ensure that the voice of Canada's cities were part of the discussion every year at the HLPF, making sure that you know, we were not only sharing some of the practices that we were seeing happen in our own country, but also networking and working with colleagues from around the world, and in some terms of some of the great work that they were doing around localizing them. You know, one of the things that I would say, you know, is probably more unique for us as a country. We, you know, I think early on, we haven't embraced the SDGs in the same way as maybe some other countries around the world have. But, you know, I think that has been getting better and something, particularly as we look forward to this year's HLPF, our second voluntary national review, and ultimately the SDG summit in September, where I think, you know, Canada will once again have an opportunity to shine in this space.
Let's hope so. Thank you, Mayor. It's great to hear that background. I'm going to go to you next, Elena, and you've been collaborating with the mayor here for many years on these issues, as he mentioned, in your prior role, and now currently at ECCC, you're doing some great work around the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. So I want to ask if you could tell us a bit about how you've seen this conversation play out over the years around bringing those municipal issues to the international level, and also what we can expect from the FSDS, the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, as a way to position Canada's approach to the SDGs this year.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks to you and Jon, just like Berry said, without your leadership and Tamarack and SDSM's leadership over the years, we wouldn't be where we are today on the SDGs. I loved having conversations around the voluntary local review with Jon several years ago about trying to get municipalities better connected and getting it beyond London, Ontario, for example, and Peterborough. So it's great to have this group here talking about this today. I'd like to first off acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And so I'd like to start there. But how I've seen it evolve, similar to Berry, who has been a real champion, not only for Kitchener-Waterloo and Canada, across Canada, but also internationally, has been remarkable. Where the local governments are today on the issues of the SDGs really comes down to people like Berry. So I just want to put that out there, that there's always if Waterloo and Kitchener ever need a spokesperson, Mayor Vrbanovic is the person to come to on SDGs. But in terms of the actual growth of the SDGs over time, especially at the local level. So previously, I had worked with Federation of Canadian Municipalities, supporting much of the work that Berry had been doing, had done, and just the fact that the Millennium Development Goals, which seem like an archaic tool now, really didn't acknowledge local governments at all. And having the SDGs finally have that dedicated goal focused on sustainable communities really shows that the local sector has come into its own now and has, is creating space for itself to demonstrate how it is responding and achieving the SDGs. The conversations, that used to be inside rooms or at offsite locations are now incorporated into the UN. And this is really a testament of all of the local government community, both in Canada and around the world. In terms of Canada's contribution to the high-level political forum, so for those who are unaware, the voluntary national reviews, so the national reviews that are done by federal governments around the world, they're required to be done 2 times within the 15-year period of the SDGs. Obviously, voluntary local reviews come in and out throughout the process and really have gained steam in the last few years. But the voluntary national review, this is Canada's second VNR that's being presented. And this year, Canada is looking at the issues of poverty, of education, of gender equality, of climate change, and of partnership. Now, the UN is looking at different goals. They're looking at issues of water and sanitation, energy, infrastructure, sustainable communities, as well as partnership. And so Canada has prepared a voluntary national review that will have a focus around the 5 main goals that it's looking at, but then have a complement sort of snapshot of all the other goals. And really, it's up to each country to decide how it wants to format its report into the UN. So they might only look at the 5 that the UN is reviewing that year. They may decide on 5 others. They may look at all 17. So each report really does have its own structure and vision and so forth. But what it's really anchored around are the global indicator framework, in which we have a Canadian indicator framework, and that's how we're reporting on our achievements towards 2030. So this year, Canada will have a delegation. It will be led by Minister Gould, the minister responsible for children, families, and social development. And the delegation will comprise of a variety of different sectors and stakeholders, of which who are contributing already to the SDGs or who are interested in getting involved more. Mayor Vrbanovic has been a member of that delegation before. I have been a member of the delegation. You have Indigenous people, you have private sector. It really is a bringing together of a whole of society approach. And as Mayor Vrbanovic mentioned already, that piece around the high-level political forum being this space that we are presenting the voluntary national review. In September, there is the SDG Summit as part of the United Nations General Assembly, at which point the Prime Minister will participate most likely in the SDG days that are focused during that period of time.
So helpful to get that overview. Thank you, Elena. I think a lot of folks have been sort of sharing recently that there's not a good sense of what we can actually expect, what's going to happen there. So that was really great. I'm going back to you, Mayor Berry. I'm wondering, as someone who's really a veteran at these HLPFs, I think on our call just before everyone joined, you shared that you'd been at almost all of them to date. So I'm curious what it's like to be at the UN headquarters during the high-level political forum and what your sense is of how Canada's going to be showing up this year.
Yeah, so, listen, first of all, the more you're there, you get used to sort of the way the whole system works and the place works. But certainly it's an amazing opportunity for anybody who perhaps does go to participate either as part of a delegation or in one of the side events and so on. It's a great networking opportunity in terms of connecting with others who are doing phenomenal work in their cities or civil society organizations and others in terms of localizing the SDGs and so on. It's a very busy 2-week period, obviously with different points of focus. The minister will obviously be very engaged during the ministerial days, which is only a portion of the 2-week period. And then there's actually in the first week a number of days when UCLG will be quite engaged, both in terms of bringing together our various global local government partners, everyone from UC, it all happens under the UCLG umbrella, but where you bring partners together like ICLEI, like C40, and others who are working in the space around the SDGs for what we call the Global Task Force. And that group typically meets at the United Nations now. As Elena said, in the early days, it wasn't like that, and it speaks to how, even though we haven't come to the point where local governments have a permanent seat at the United Nations, which is something we're advocating for, there is a much there's a much higher level of engagement with local governments, and a recognition that none of this work will actually see success if it doesn't start at the grassroots, and if it doesn't start at the most local levels. And of course, the most local sphere of government is local and regional governments. And so we've been able to, over the years, not only be invited to the table, but also be actively engaged in many of the discussions that are happening that actually continue to shape the work of the UN, whether it's through the HLPF and the SDGs, whether it's through the work of UN Habitat, and some of the other important documents like the New Urban Agenda and others that are helping really guide cities going forward. I think it's important to remember that Canada's and the world's cities are really engines of economic growth and the hubs of creativity and innovation. But at the same time, they're also the places where we see some of our greatest challenges and problems, whether it's environmental degradation or the lack of social and economic cohesion in many areas, particularly coming out of the pandemic. And so it's so important to use these forums such as the HLPF and the UN to come forward and to really use them as an opportunity to see how we're doing on that roadmap to flipping the script and really attaining the goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of the SDGs. When we think back to prior to the SDGs, there was something called the Millennium Development Goals. And, most people would largely agree that those MDGs did not see the success that was originally hoped for when they were ratified in 2000, because they didn't involve and didn't engage local governments. And so, now as we go forward and think about that path forward, it's really about ensuring that there's a shift towards that and a more sustainable future that really makes sure that no person and no place is left behind.
That's great to hear. Really encouraging, I think. It sounds like we're heading in the right direction over the past couple decades. So thank you. And Elena, you've been to HLPF as well many times. Anything you want to share about what it's like to be there? And maybe I'll throw in another question, which is why the HLPF matters, why people should care here on this call who are working locally in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. So as Barry said, the energy is unique, and bringing together people from around the world on whatever topic it might be, talking about the Paris Agreement, talking about the habitat, for example, or even the HLPF. You're really pulling those individuals and meeting with those individuals who are really making advances in addressing the global issues that we face every day. And so it's, there's a number of side sessions that you can attend if you're able to join the ministerial meetings, mostly a federal representative, but there's something for everyone, kind of thing, right? And the networks that you build through those events are phenomenal. I would say that would be sort of how I feel about that that event. What was the second part of the question? Just to make sure I got the point.
Yeah, why people should care about
why people should care.
who are working in communities.
So I think it goes back to really the it's not so much the HLPF as one unique event, and it's an event in amongst many others, right, that are helping to move progress and make progress in the achievement of the SDGs. What we need to think about, and we need to recognize and really care about is the actual agenda itself, and using the HLPF as a way to leverage that space to demonstrate our progress and to understand what others are doing around the world on a variety of topics. The UN changes its goals under review every year, and they sort of cluster the goals that they review sort of around a similar theme. But Canada really has put forward its priority areas. There's been lots of advances around the issue of climate change over the last number of years. And so, for example, to your earlier point around the federal sustainable development strategy, which is really it's a federal document. It is a strategy that's developed by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it is framed around the SDGs. It's framed around the 17 goals. It's sort of Canada's take around each of the goals. So you'll have a goal around number 10, for example, which talks at the global level around broadly inequalities. Well, in Canada and around the FSDS, the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, it would talk about the reconciliation with Indigenous people and inequality. So it's sort of a Canadianized version of it. So we were able, through Environment Canada, to contribute to the voluntary national review using that lens to inform our progress related to Goal 13 on climate change and Goal 15 around life on land. There's obviously there's COP15 back in December that really is shaping the agenda. There is our re-release of an adaptation plan today by the minister. There's a lot of advancement in this area, and so Canada should be proud of its steps forward and the responsibility it has in working with other stakeholders, Indigenous people, civil society, private sector, and other levels of government to advance the work on the SDGs. So I think it's really not so much about the HLPF per se, but it's more about the broader interrelationship of the goals and the goals themselves.
Thanks. And really appreciate that framing. It's helpful. So I'm passing it over to Jon in a sec, who's going to continue with questions. I just want a reminder to everyone who's here that we are going into Q&A shortly. So please do put questions you have that are coming up for you in the chat, or you can, when we go to it, you can use the raise hand function. So thanks.
Thanks, Laura. And maybe this question I wanted to ask to you, Mayor Berry. Kind of this idea of what do you hope to see about the localization of the SDGs at the UN? You've talked a bit about the progress that's been made. I think it even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've heard you speak previously about how you had to be kind of one of the advocates to really include SDG 11 on cities and communities in the 17 goals to start with. So there's obviously been kind of a constant pushing, spotlighting to the front of municipal issues in these global agendas. So kind of in this kind of a forum, are there specific messages or kind of asks that you really are trying to get across that at these kind of gatherings on the localization front?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Jon, and I think it is a good point to reiterate, and I often say this to new municipal leaders, who come forward and remind them of how much progress we've made from the fact, there was a time when we couldn't even get a room inside the UN to meet, and we would have to have a global task force, meetings in a hotel meeting room, and now we have partners that come to the table and work with us in order to in order to make stuff happen, and it's wonderful that way, and we're seeing it more and more as we go forward. I think for me, the annual HLPF is really a renewed opportunity for us each year to remind national governments and the partners that work with them, the local and regional governments really are at the forefront of change, that we're the order of government that's best positioned to represent communities at both national and international decision-making tables, like the UN. As a result of our understanding of the needs and aspirations of the people that we serve in our communities, and it's organizations like UCLG globally, FCM from a Canadian perspective, really play an important role in advancing those arguments and sharing the information of what's happening. There are a number of Canadian cities, my own included, who are doing some really great work in terms of advancing the SDGs, localizing them, and part of it is we want to be able to share that with our colleagues from other parts of the world to demonstrate that Canada truly is at the table and moving the bar forward in terms of SDGs. Because it really, is interconnected with so much of the other work that we do at the UN, whether it comes, times such as the Sendai disaster framework, or whether we're talking about, the Paris Climate Accord and so on. Like, all of these things are interconnected and intertwined. And so it really is important that we both are engaged and that we showcase the work that Canadians are doing, because we are doing some really good work. I know, for example, the SDSN network, as an example, did such an amazing job with colleges and universities this past spring in terms of building awareness and getting people engaged, and I applaud you for it. And it's the kind of thing that I'm hoping we'll be able to do more of. And at some point today, I'll maybe get a chance to even chat a little bit about one of the things that we've created, which is a new SDG idea factory here in the city of Kitchener.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we just kind of, maybe Elena, I'll come back to you on that in a minute, but why don't you talk a bit about that? One question I kind of had to follow up on was, the idea of, we go to these international gatherings, but then bringing that kind of, the wins or the attention from those international gatherings back to our communities. So I was at the launch of the Ideas Factory in Kitchener. It's great. It's a fantastic space to activate the SDGs in the community. So, like, how do you bring kind of like that momentum from New York back to Kitchener, into those spaces?
Yeah, often it's really listening to ideas that are generated in other places and thinking about how you can apply them here. And so one of the things that UCLG has been doing globally is creating these SDG local for action hubs around the world. And there hadn't been one created in North America yet. As a city in 2019, for the first time, we incorporated the SDGs into our strategic plan. And I'm happy that both the cities of Cambridge and Waterloo did, as well as did the region. We're now doing that again with the next version of the plan, which is actually the start of our next 20-year plan, which we'll be adopting later this year, and the first 4 years that coincides with the term of council. And so that's certainly been one piece of the work, but how do you make it more concrete? And so, we were always thinking about it. And one of the things that we focused on was our small business center, our economic development strategy. Coming out of the pandemic, we were seeing increasingly and hearing from groups that really wanted to work in this space. And so we thought, okay, how do we marry all these ideas together? And we came up with the SDG Idea Factory, which is an incubator in downtown Kitchener in the old BMO building at King and Queen. It was thrilled to have both Minister Gould and Lieutenant Governor Dowdeswell here to open it. And it's a small business incubator that's focused on new small businesses in the sustainability space, in the space of social enterprises, and in the space of women and equity-seeking group-led businesses. And there's been, huge interest in it. We've got a number of partners who are part of it from the beginning, and others who are looking to participate in it going forward. And we're quite excited about the potential that it'll have to not only generate new businesses, but really demonstrate in a very concrete way how we're working to localize the SDGs here in Kitchener.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think we can probably everyone working on the SDGs can attest, it's hard to figure out those tangible ways to actually bring them and give them life, so we see the goals and we agree on the ambitions, but then it's like grounding them, integrating them into our action is always such a crucial part of this.
Can I just jump on that, John?
Yeah.
And I think that goes to that whole point around what localization means. Localization, it means many things. I mean, it's a term that definitely we've been hearing for Barry and I for the last 8 years plus, I think, at the international level, and then translating in here is like, what is that? But localization is to be local, right? It's to be community based, is to be what makes sense and what are the priorities for a given community, right? And so it made sense for where Kitchener is at, and Kitchener-Waterloo, in terms of its entrepreneurship and its incubators and so forth, and a variety of other things, to make that space, right? But I think sometimes people do get caught up a lot in, trying to align what they're doing with something else so that they're achieving the SDGs, but ultimately they are doing things that are achieving the SDGs, right? Having broader public consultations, for example, is around engaging folks and getting their feedback and contributing and leaving no one behind in a very simplified way of doing business. Again, as I said earlier, I mean, we've had a number of advances in terms of having some deep net zero plans, emission reduction plans. We're working on single-use plastic now. These are all going to contribute, but it really does involve a variety of stakeholders. And again, right sizing, whatever that looks like, to the local community. So I just wanted to jump on that to say kind of that piece around back to localization.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Maybe before we move on to the next question, Elena, I just kind of finishing with the previous one, thinking about these international gatherings, from your perspective with the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy and your work within the federal government, how do you see kind of these gatherings helping to channel that attention on the SDGs back in Canada? In this case for the FSDS or other initiatives you're working on.
Yeah, so the FSDS, for the first time, it received royal assent back in November of 2022. So it's still fresh, and I hope people can check it out. But for the first time, it is framed around the SDGs, the goals, again, the principles. So you look at FSDS goal 6, it might not look exactly like the SDG, but it has alignment around water sanitation, for example. But I think that is it's a Canadian, it's brought into the Canadian context, and it's showing how the federal organizations are sort of contributing to the SDGs in a direct or indirect way. But what really makes that strategy, and for future strategies, is the stakeholders, is the external stakeholders. It's not just about the federal community that's speaking and just putting in a whole bunch of this plan or that plan, but to actually understand it from the Canadian society around where Canada should go in terms of addressing these things. And so we hold a public consultation in advance of this particular strategy. We will do that again in advance of the next one, and kind of get feedback. And I think to the HLPF piece, it's a similar way, is that the Canadian delegation is selected based around those that are interested and have been involved and so forth. But it's really up to those individuals to go to those international events, take in whatever they can based around what matters to them and their organization, or the Canadian objectives and so forth, and bring that back and then actually bring it into their community. Go and meet with your elected leadership at the local level. Talk about things that are happening in other places in the world. Let them learn from you what it means to do, better work around sustainable development, right? And always looking at it from an environmental, a social, and economic lens, because one cannot be a standalone. They must interrelate, just like the SDGs need to. There needs to be a woven storyline between the various SDGs.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions from me. I see one from Darlene in the chat. So it's a reminder as well for anybody who has a question, put it in the chat. You can raise your hand if you want to come on camera. But the next question I wanted to explore, maybe over to you, Mayor Berry, around opportunities at the HLPF for kind of more community-oriented groups to participate. So I talked about some of the side events, the civil society presence. Generally, HLPF seems kind of government focused in many ways, but kind of if you're a community group, you want to participate in the international level, how do you kind of see that involvement happening?
So, certainly through the networks that many of those community groups are involved in, those are really the opportunities to become engaged, as well as connecting with the federal government. If you're looking to potentially, be part of a panel or be part of the official delegation, and so on. I always marvel actually at the overall scope of civil society that participates in HLPF every year. I would say that they actually, in many respects, far outnumber the politicos or those sort of that are connected with the politicians, which is exactly what should happen. Because again, I'll go back to what we learned in the Millennium Development Goals. When you take this approach of sort of starting everything from on high and pushing it down, it doesn't work. We don't make any progress. But when you recognize that actually the way to implement change is to get, the grassroots, to get civil society, to get local government to embrace these goals and to, look at how we can really implement them in our day-to-day lives, that is so critical. And so it's quite encouraging to see how that actually comes alive every year in July in New York.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like having attended one HLPF, I feel like that really animates the conversations, knowing there are so many side events, so many different conversations coming together, and it's not just kind of that higher level.
And then, one thing I forgot to say is there is usually an amazing group of youth that are there, and if you want to be energized and inspired and leave with hope for the future for our cities and our planet, wow, that's hanging out with those folks for a little bit is always a great way to do that.
Thank you. Elena, did you want to add anything on that kind of opportunities, more community-oriented groups to participate?
Yeah, I mean, New York and the UN and the HLPF are big events, right? I mean, it takes a lot for folks to get there and so forth, and not necessarily everyone has the means to do that. And so I think that really it's about if you're not able to join the delegation and you're not able to participate in person, it's to ensure that you're participating in the consultation process. So earlier this year, Minister Gould announced that there would be a VNR actually at FCM's Sustainable Communities Conference, and then at the same time launched the call for inputs, right? And so there's an opportunity for all of society, individuals, organizations, to contribute to what the actual report looks like at the end of the day. And that goes the same with the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, is that it's about that community engagement, right? I mean, the strategy, when I speak about the strategy, the FSDS, it's a better document because it has community-based organizations and stakeholders contributing to it, right? And to understand what is the temperature amongst, different stakeholders. And really, we then promote out what we heard documents and things like that, depending on obviously the consultation that's happening. But really, I would encourage, even if you're not able to be present physically in New York during HLPF or any other type of multilateral event, is to really identify those opportunities and take the time to contribute a short response, a long response. Those things do get considered, and they definitely find their way into different spaces.
And you know what, Elena, one thing that both of us forgot to mention is that for those who can't get down there to participate, the UN does a really good job through their website and UN TV to actually cover a lot of these sessions, and you can actually follow along, at least a lot of the major ones, through that mechanism, which is great.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'll just kind of follow up on that. There's a question from Alicia in the chat, which we may have touched on a little bit, but I'll present it. If you have any kind of encouragement, recommendations for professionals or community members who may be more hesitant to engage and invest in kind of the HLPF or these bigger discussions, do you have any encouragements that you would have on that front? Obviously, participating online maybe is like a lower barrier. There's Alicia, actually. Why don't you go ahead, Alicia, if you want to.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. I meant for like those of us who are really interested and really want to see VLRs developed in our municipalities, but it's very hard to get that happening when you're living in a municipality where the municipal leadership is kind of like, I don't know about that.
Okay, I see. Yeah, great. So like trying to encourage more VLRs reporting integration at for your own municipality. Okay, yeah, why don't we, if anybody
Start with Barry.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would say to you, first of all, is if you want to bend the ear of your local elected officials, always happy to have you tell them to connect with me, and I can certainly talk about our own experience and what we do rather, and why it makes sense to incorporate into things like a strategic plan, but also to go to much more significant steps like the idea factory that I talked about earlier. But at the end of the day, it really boils down to this: we've got one planet, and we know that we've got some pretty significant challenges that we need to face head on if we're going to make sure that this planet and our societies can continue to thrive for decades to come. We can only talk about a sustainable future if we ensure that it's equitable for everyone, and the rights of everyone, including those most vulnerable in our cities, are protected, and we recognize, particularly coming out of the pandemic, I think it's demonstrated more than ever, and just some of the geopolitical realities of our world today. The interconnectedness of our communities and of our societies, and this is where we need to focus our work. As I said earlier, we truly want to make sure that no person and no place is left behind.
Thank you. I want to just add, there's a couple other questions coming in, but I want to just make sure we cover my last question here around, what's the inspiration you're looking to from other cities around the world on this work? I know it's been a continually growing community over the last 8 years, and so are there particular cities, Mayor Berry, that you're seeing, that you look to and kind of say, okay, how can we bring this to the city of Kitchener and this region more generally?
Yeah, listen, there's obviously a whole lot of people who are doing some work in this space. Vancouver has certainly been, sorry, not Vancouver, New York has certainly been a leader in terms of the work, particularly around voluntary local reviews across Canada. We've seen cities like Kelowna and Winnipeg and Fort Saskatchewan and others, in addition to the ones in our region. Cities like Barcelona have certainly been champions of this work. It just so happens that that's also where our UCLG headquarters is, and so obviously there's a lot of coordination and collaboration that happens there. But one of the documents I want to urge you to maybe check out is on the UCLG website, and it's the Gold 5 report, which was issued in 2019. And that report is focused on the localization of the global agendas, including the SDGs, and the work that's being done by cities and regions in each part of the world. It's obviously a few years old now, but it certainly gives you some great perspectives. And so if you go to uclg.org and simply look for Gold 5, you'll find it. And I think many of the people on this call will find it quite interesting. Actually, I see Laura put it into the link. Yeah. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Elena, did you want to add anything there? I'm going to go to Darlene's question next, but
yeah. So just to add to that, I mean, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge now, I guess, have really taken some big steps to align what they're doing around their strategic plan with the SDGs, and just to not everyone is going to take those steps. I mean, maybe in an ideal world everyone did, but that's not realistic. I think we have to look to communities across the country and find really innovative things that are happening, and replicable things, initiatives. So for example, in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, there's some really great work around like energy poverty, for example, right? Energy poverty isn't something that people talk about, I don't think, regularly, right? But then again, it translates to a global issue in many continents, right? And so, I would say, look to those communities, look to a lot of the community work, a lot of the SDG work is being done in the smaller communities. It's also being done in the big cities. Toronto has extensive work on inclusion, for example, that should be looked at. And so again, it's great to have the champions like the Kitchener Waterloos of the world and the other municipalities that Barry has mentioned, but you also have to look at the communities that have, taking some proactive steps to address poverty, to address climate, to address gender equality or whatnot, building stronger institutions, because you're going to get a good sampling of different ideas and initiatives that your municipality and you as a civil society representative could help to advance within your community.
Great, thank you. So we're kind of closing in on the hour, so I want to get a couple of these questions in as quickly as we can. But from Darlene, a question around what do you hope to hear from Canada's voluntary national review report, and what recommendations you would offer to the federal government for accelerating progress, perhaps with a few examples? Any thoughts from either of you? Elena, might be a harder one for you to answer.
Yeah, a little hard for me. But yeah, I can speak to the goals that are being highlighted if you want. But Barry, go ahead first.
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, obviously, it's an opportunity for us to highlight some of the great things that we're doing as a country in this regard. Kitchener was part of the 2018 VNR and was part of the delegation that Minister Duclos hosted at the time, and we in particular focused on around our digital Kitchener strategy that year. Which was really looking at about digital equity and so on. I think what I would say is a comment I made earlier on, which is I think compared to some countries, I don't think that we developed a national strategy around engaging cities and around localizing things in the same way as some countries in Europe, South America, Africa, and other places did. And, you know, I mean, you can always say, well, you know, we should have, it was a lost opportunity. I don't like looking backwards. I believe in looking forwards. And I think, you know, we're well positioned now, particularly with the role that that the Prime Minister has, with the midpoint, with the summit being this year. I'm really hopeful that we're going to embrace that and really sort of up our game in that space, because I think it's so important, both in terms of advancing this work within Canada, and we see lots of great work happening through things like SDSN, through Tamarack, through our elementary schools, our colleges and universities, and so on. So let's actually, you know, bring some of those other partners to the table and engage them in a more significant way going forward, because I think that's truly how we're going to see the best success going forward.
Great, thank you. And then we'll just quickly try and do this question in a couple of minutes, but a question from Lori. They've just returned from COSP 16 at the UN in New York, and colleagues in the disability community are having a similar conversation about participation in information sharing. Disability inclusion and the Sustainable Development Goals were the focus of a few side party events. Their quadrennial reports require reporting on activities in support of the SDGs, and the questions are around any thought on sharing this information amongst community partners nationally, and is there a mechanism other than community driven to do this? So I don't know if that, maybe Laura, you might want to come on to clarify at all, but I don't know if Elena and Barry, if there's anything that pops to mind for you on this question.
Sounds like more an Elena question for me.
Yeah, okay.
So I guess, I mean, I might not be answering the question, or exact question, but I'll try. I mean, I keep going back to the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. So there's the National Agenda towards 2030, which is the whole of society strategy. The Federal Sustainable Development Strategy does bring together the initiatives across government around issues. So working with Shared Services Canada, for example, around the issues of accessibility, working with wage to ensure that Goal 5 is recognized in terms of Canada's response. So again, there's an opportunity to connect with that strategy and to connect with relevant departments. But there's also those opportunities to engage through consultations. And that really is the spot where, you know, it's the government is looking to have input from different stakeholders. The issue of accessibility, I mean, we look at it all the time in terms of, you know, how our information is being presented, for example, like going back to the strategy, how do we, is it accessible online? Is it what kind of consultation tools do we use to make sure that everyone can come into the conversation? And at the local level, they do that same thing, right? I mean, many communities, from even just a language point of view, right, offer services in a variety of language depending on their communities to ensure that more people can come to the table. So I'm sure that didn't really answer your question, but there is mechanisms through various whole of government strategies and plans. The quality of life reporting framework is another one, and there's a data hub on StatsCan. There's the FSDS. There's again the national strategy towards Agenda 2030. Those are just some of them that would have an opportunity to connect into that piece around improving the quality of life of Canadians and those that reside in Canada.
Thank you so much. We are coming up on the hour. I'm going to pass it back to Laura to do a couple of quick announcements to wrap up, but I'll just say my personal thanks, Barry and Elena, for participating and sharing. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So over to you, Laura.
Likewise, thank you both. This was a terrific conversation today, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. So really quickly, we have a feedback form. If you can take a minute to offer some quick feedback, we'd really appreciate that on today's session. A reminder to join this community of practice if you're not already part of it, to come to our monthly sessions. So my colleague will be putting the link in the chat. We'll be taking a break for July, August. Enjoy your summers. We'll resume in September. So do sign up to stay involved. And a reminder that HLPF meeting starts in July. In the coming 2 weeks, you can find more about Canada's progress report on the website, which we'll be putting in the chat as well. And Together Ensemble, the National Conference on the SDGs, wrapped up earlier this month. You can find the recordings online. The website will be in the chat for you as well. And one of our partners on the call, IISD, is hosting a side event. So there was conversation earlier in this chat about side events, and there's an HLPF side event called What Happens After the VLR, Voluntary Local Review, a conversation about the transformative impact of SDG localization and voluntary local reporting. So I put some info there, and it's happening on July 11th at 6:30 p.m. and it will be announced on social media in the coming days. A registration link will be shared. So we will share all of this in the follow-up email. So don't worry if you weren't able to get all those links. But thank you again for being here, and look forward to seeing you next time.